A small group of people stood next to the open coffin. Only a few people went to the funeral. Everyone sat next to a nearby parking lot. Two people seemed eager to say goodbye to the deceased. When the last person left the cemetery, they got out of the car and the sister of the deceased hastened to announce that everything was ready for dinner at her house for celebration. So she invited them all to a funeral dinner. Some women insisted that she wait until the coffin was lowered into the tomb to throw in a handful of dirt, he said to Elizabeth. The woman was sobbing uneasily on the spot. She didn't want people to see that she had agreed to participate in some experiment. It was indecent to kick everyone out of the cemetery, and she would have to explain what the two young people were going to do with the coffin. It was simple. Their task was to install a camera inside the deceased's coffin. Elizabeth was uncomfortable telling people that she decided to make money off her dead brother, so she kept silent about the monetary reward, and the young scientist who installed the camera explained that this was a scientific study. It was clear that they were cool with it. Sister's decision to help science, and no one condemned her. Everything is ready, bring cover. When they finished installing the camera, one of the scientists twisted two screws and lowered the coffin into the cova using some ropes. Elizabeth wiped away her tears and took a handful of earth. "Excuse my condolences," a woman said, putting her hand on her shoulder. Elizabeth looked at her with an air of confusion. She didn't know anyone. She rarely spoke to her brother, and she was only sure of one thing. He had no family or woman he would have a close relationship with. The grave was covered with earth, and this mysterious woman lay there watching the tomb. She remained close to Elizabeth until she resolved to share her memories. The deceased sister heard this old lady. "What makes you think I'm interested in these conversations? My brother was 7 years older. We had no interests in common," she said impiously. "Elizabeth, if it weren't for his sudden death, I wouldn't go deeper into his life." Now Elizabeth's thoughts were about something else, and Elizabeth continued, "My brother was a very good person. Although I didn't have this direct contact with him often, he left all his possessions to a nursing home." Deep down, this even irritated Elizabeth because she had to organize a funeral, collect all the documents and organize a commemoration. The sister of the deceased completed this nursing home. Now it even bears his name, you know. On the day of his death, Elizabeth went to visit Jose and found him sleeping on the sofa. Soon she noticed that he wasn't breathing and went into despair. Could it be that he really was dead? 15 minutes later, the ambulance crew confirmed that the man was dead, so she went to the hospital with him because she didn't know what people usually do in such cases. The doctors said that the man should be referred for an autopsy to determine the cause of death. Elizabeth was lost. She had never imagined that her visit would end like this. Then she asked to skip this procedure, but it was explained to her that the rules would not be violated if a person does not suffer from any disease. The autopsy is mandatory. The sister recalled that her brother had complained from the heart, told the doctors, and they found out that the man really had heart problems, but only a pathologist can say the exact cause of death. So the elderly lady had no choice but to agree, but the two boys helped. For several days they were looking for volunteers who agreed to experiment. Since they arbitrarily cannot carry out any experiments on cadavers, they needed the consent of relatives from a deceased person, and so far they haven't gotten any, so this sister and brother was the perfect fit for them. Elizabeth with regret informed them that a pathologist would soon take care of her brother, but in the end these young scientists convinced the doctors that there was no need to perform an autopsy. After discussing a diagnosis of the deceased, they decided that death really occurred due to pathology of the heart. The elderly woman was happy for the fact that her brother's death must not have been so painful. He must have had a cardiac arrest, and in seconds his heart simply stopped beating. Elizabeth was sure that if her brother had the opportunity to express his opinion, he would have preferred to have been buried intact. After talking with the boys, she accepted the scientist's proposal. Her conscience still tormented her. She agreed to put a video camera in the coffin, but did not violate any of God's commandments. She thought, "I can't bring my brother back, but the extra money won't hurt anyone." And of course it was the reward that made her agree to this offer. The participation fee for this experiment was high, so with the death of her brother ended up not appearing not only sadness but also joy. On the same day when the cameras were installed on the coffin, she received a transfer of $10,000. Elizabeth did not believe it. In the end, the scientists were in fact maintaining that they had said she received a reward so quickly. This gift was so nice, especially after she found out at the funeral that her brother gave his money to some random old men. It later turned out that there was a reason why the sister didn't like that chatty woman at the funeral. The woman was an employee of a nursing home. Elizabeth figured she was probably trying to get close to her lonely brother to take over the house he had built. In the end, she decided not to worry about it. She hadn't thought about it before, and now there was no reason to be upset. That's it. Somewhere you win, and somewhere you lose. With scientists it turned out to be even more profitable. This experiment that Elizabeth agreed to, it was very simple. She didn't want to know the results. It was very unpleasant, so the scientists had to observe the decomposition of the body. The battery that powered that camera would last about a year. This camera would not stay on all day. It will turn on automatically once a day for 1 minute at exactly 2300 hours. This camera will record what is happening and then turn off again. These are the details that the scientists gave. She thought that how that experiment could improve her living conditions and who knows even go on a cruise. Elizabeth was less than 60 years old and still had all the right in the world to dream. After the funeral, Elizabeth went home. Finally she could completely forget about her brother. Luckily they never got close. She would not suffer too much for him. Scientists would have to take care of her brother for a year. The most interesting thing will be when all the data is collected, but first they needed to verify that everything was working. Well, the two guys would wait impatiently for the camera to turn on every day to make sure everything was set up correctly. That night they wanted to get home as soon as possible to see if everything was going correctly. The first day they saw something strange, so rewind a 1-minute tape several times to be sure of what they saw. They discussed the video trying to find a logical explanation for why this was happening. The body could have moved when it was lowered into the coffin or when the lid was closed. In fact, there were few options. In either case, they could explain why the body was not as it was at the funeral. The hands were on the head, and the body itself was bent over as if the man was trying to get out of the coffin. The scientists just found it very strange and were shocked. They decided to run to the cemetery and dig the grave. They didn't think twice, they did it all themselves. To get permission to dig would probably take time, and if they found out that their opposition is correct, then every minute mattered. They found that their decision was correct. The man in the coffin was alive. Jose needed the doctor's help urgently. When he opened the coffin, the man was almost out of energy. He breathed out the bottom and started to say who was responsible for his death. After arriving at the nearest hospital there and receive all the medical help, Jose reported that his sister had been poisoned. That day, Elizabeth went to visit him and started saying that he wanted to borrow his diamonds. Elizabeth was Jose's sister. When he was 18 years old, his father married a woman and he had a small daughter. My sister had 11 years old and she was a very peculiar child. She was jealous of her mother and threw dramatic tantrums. The father at the time ignored his new daughter's bad behavior just because he loved his wife. Joseph soon started living alone, and never got close to Elizabeth. Her father was a rich man. He had a strange hobby. However, he collected diamonds. With his death long after, he left his collection to his only legitimate son Joseph, and considered this position quite fair. Furthermore, his father had never deprived Elizabeth of anything either. A year later, Elizabeth began trying to build a relationship with her half-brother. Joseph thought that a woman in her old age just wanted to get closer to her half-brother so she wouldn't live so alone, but it turned out that Elizabeth pursued other interests. Somehow she started talking about diamonds and her brother understood everything. My sister turned into a greedy old woman who chased money for 5 years, pressing and demanded that he at least divide his inheritance equally because a lonely old man needs so much wealth. His only hobby is fishing. Elizabeth asked on the day of the visit her pension would be enough for him. She was sure. José didn't take it too seriously and joked with her, saying, "And the lady, why do you need diamonds at your age? You're going to go around the world." The old sister, it didn't bother her too much. She visited infrequently and talked about the diamonds. Basically the same conversation. He thought she wouldn't do anything bad. Until that night everything changed. That day in his apartment, Elizabeth came to him on another visit and started talking about diamonds again, and said that she was already quite tired of these conversations. It would be better for him to voluntarily share with her the inheritance. They drank tea. José was joking as usual. Then he felt that he was falling asleep. His sister soon helped him to the sofa. He couldn't do anything with his eyes closed. As if it were a dream, I saw Elizabeth looking for something in the room and realized that her half-sister had put something in the tea to rummage through home. The old man didn't expect such a mess, and of course he didn't think his sister wanted to kill him. Then he woke up in a coffin. Apparently sister went too far with sleeping pills. He really had heart problems, and it was surprising that after such a huge dose of medicine he survived everything. Somehow he was lucky. Elizabeth did not want to sacrifice her brother. She planned to find the diamonds and take them while her brother was sleeping. Knowing her brother, he would not go to the police, and if he did, she would strongly deny everything. But she did not find any jewelry in the house and tried to wake her brother up to force him to confess where he had hidden the diamonds. But he didn't show signs of life, so she came up with that plan. She put the glasses away so no one could see that they'd already had them together, and she said she discovered her brother's body when she went into the open house. She was left with nothing, but luckily no one suspected anything. Then these scientists appeared. Without thinking twice she decided that at least she would get something from her brother, having agreed to the experiment and received a nice monetary reward. Finally the elderly woman sat at home and planned her luxurious cruise, but when the bell rang she was very surprised to see the deceased accompanied by police. The sister did not think her brother was alive, and the fact that she was trying to win with his death actually saved his life. Of course Elizabeth had to be punished for what she did. But at the insistence of the victim she received a minimum sentence. José had not had diamonds for a long time. He did not need them for his use. His money was for the greater good. Even better that he helped children with oncology. It's a shame that your sister had to spend some time in a cell because of this inheritance, instead of doing the cruise you wanted, but greed doesn't do anyone any good. It's better to have little more honestly earning than trying to get money from others. José continues to enjoy fishing and did not understand why people wanted some kind of luxury too big. For him the greatest riches in life are not bought with money.